I never meant to fall for her, but the way she smiled that night, soft, steady, and a little broken, changed everything. It was one of those nights that felt heavier than it should, the kind where the air smelled of rain and asphalt, and the world seemed to move slower than usual. I ducked into a small cafe to escape the drizzle, the kind of place that looked half asleep even when the lights were on. A soft hum of jazz drifted through the speakers, and the air carried that comforting mix of coffee, warmth, and something almost nostalgic. I remember shaking the water from my jacket, running a hand through my hair, and scanning for an empty seat. That's when I saw her. She was sitting by the window, framed by the faint golden glow of the streetlight outside. A book lay open in front of her, but her eyes weren't on the page. They were distant, watching the rain trace uneven lines down the glass. There was a quiet elegance about her, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind you feel before you even realize you're looking. Something about her presence slowed me down. When our eyes met, I felt it, that almost imperceptible jolt, like recognition from another life. She smiled, small, polite, yet impossibly disarming, and gestured to the chair across from her. "Go ahead," she said, voice calm, rich and low, the kind that makes silence sound like a choice. I sat down, pretending to be more collected than I was. My fingers wrapped around the warm cup the barista handed me, but my focus never really left her. For a few moments, we said nothing, just the soft tapping of rain outside and the faint sound of her turning a page she hadn't been reading. When I reached for the sugar, our hands brushed. Barely a touch, but enough to make me forget what I was reaching for. Her skin was warm, softer than I expected. She glanced up, meeting my startled look with a quiet smile that seemed to say, "You felt it too, didn't you?" We exchanged small words about the weather, the music, the way the city feels different when it rains. But beneath it all, there was a current neither of us acknowledged. Every pause between sentences seemed to hum with something unspoken. When she finally stood to leave, she slipped her book in her bag and looked at me once more, the kind of look that lasts longer than it should. "Maybe I'll see you again," she said. Then she was gone, out into the misty night, umbrella in hand, her silhouette fading into the blur of streetlights and rain. I sat there long after, staring at the empty chair across from me, my coffee untouched and cooling. And though I didn't know her name, her smile stayed with me. Gentle, restrained, and full of something I couldn't quite name. But deep down, I already knew that moment wasn't the end of something passing. It was the beginning of something I wasn't ready for. I told myself that night had meant nothing, just a passing moment with a stranger. But a few days later, I walked back into the same cafe, half hoping, half pretending I wasn't. And there she was. Same table, same soft light falling across her face. Only this time, when she looked up, she smiled like she'd been expecting me. I laughed nervously, trying to play it cool. "You always sit here." "Only when it rains," she said, closing her book, the same one she hadn't read last time. It became a rhythm after that. Sometimes I'd find her already there. Other times, she'd arrive a few minutes after me. The barista started to notice, always setting down 2 cups instead of 1. At first, our conversations were light. We talked about simple things, music, the taste of cinnamon in coffee, the comfort of quiet corners. But slowly, they began to stretch into longer silences and deeper confessions. She told me she used to travel a lot, places she described in soft, wistful tones, like postcard from another version of herself. "You know," she said one evening, stirring her drink absent-mindedly, "I think the hardest thing is realizing how easy it is to forget who you used to be." I remember watching the reflection of light in her eyes, the way her voice dipped just slightly when she said it. I wanted to say something meaningful, something that made sense of the ache in her words, but I just nodded. There was a calm between us that didn't need filling. Sometimes she'd talk, and I'd listen. Other times, I'd tell her about the uncertainty of my own life, the things I hadn't figured out yet, the things I was afraid to want. She'd smile softly, resting her chin on her hand. "You're young," she said. "You still think you have to know everything before you begin. You don't." Her words settled somewhere deep in me. That night, She laughed, really laughed, at some half-finished story I told. The sound caught me off guard. Her eyes softened, and without thinking, she reached across the table, touching my arm lightly. It wasn't deliberate, more instinct than intention, but stopped time for a second. Her fingertips rested there, gentle but steady. "You remind me what it's like to feel alive again," she said quietly, almost to herself. The café felt smaller then, warmer somehow. The light between us glowed softer. My pulse quickened, not from the words themselves, but from the sincerity behind them, the kind that can't be rehearsed. I didn't know what to say, so I just looked at her, memorizing that expression, the faint smile, the glimmer of vulnerability in her eyes. When she finally pulled her hand away, it left a trace of warmth that stayed long after she was gone. And as I watched her walk out into the fading light, I realized something dangerous. I wasn't just curious about her anymore. I was drawn to her. That evening, the sky looked like it had been brushed with silver, thin clouds scattered across a pale moon, the air cool enough to make you notice your breath. The café was closing early, the lights dimming one by one, and she was still sitting there, tracing circles on the rim of her cup. When I offered to walk her home, she hesitated at first. That small, polite resistance people give before accepting what they already want. "You don't have to," she said softly. "I know," I replied, already holding the door open. Outside, the city had quieted down. The rain from earlier had dried into the scent of damp earth and night air. We walked side by side, not touching, just close enough that I could hear the rustle of her coat and the faint rhythm of her breathing. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt fragile, like speaking too loud might break it. Then she said, "You ever notice how cities feel different at night? Like everyone's stories are still hanging in the air." I nodded. Maybe that's why it's easier to talk then. She looked at me, that small, knowing smile returning. Or harder. Depends on what you're trying to say. We turned down a quieter street, the kind lined with old brick houses and flickering lampposts. I could feel her slowing her pace slightly, like she wanted the walk to last longer. She started telling me about her life, not in detail, just fragments. A marriage that ended quietly, a career she'd once loved but no longer recognized. "Sometimes," she said, her voice almost breaking, "you get so good at being strong that you forget what it's like to be held." The words hit deeper than she probably meant them to. I wanted to reach for her hand, to tell her she didn't have to be strong right now. Not with me, but I didn't. Instead, I walked closer, close enough that our shoulders brushed as we passed under a streetlight. The faintest touch, but it sent something through me, that electric warmth that sits somewhere between fear and longing. When we reached her building, she stopped by the gate, turning toward me with that same gentle calm she carried everywhere. "Thank you for walking me," she said. "It's nothing." "No," she said quietly. "It's not nothing." She hesitated before unlocking the gate, her fingers brushing the metal latch. For a moment, she looked like she might say something more. Then instead she smiled, that same soft, bittersweet smile I'd first seen across the cafe table. The porch light caught her hair, turning it gold at the edges. She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume again, something subtle, like jasmine and rain. "Good night," she whispered. "Good night," I managed. And then she was gone, the sound of her footsteps fading up the stairs. I stood there for a long time, looking at the door she'd just closed behind her. The night felt colder without her beside me. And though we hadn't touched, not really, I felt her everywhere. It happened on a Thursday evening, a week after our walk. I was leaving work when her message appeared on my phone. "If you're not busy tonight, I could use a hand fixing a bookshelf." I smiled, the kind of smile you try to hide from yourself. Her apartment sat on the edge of the old district, a quiet building wrapped in ivy and fading brick. When she opened the door, the warm light from inside spilled into the hallway, and for a moment I just stood there, caught between politeness and awe. She wore something simple, a soft gray sweater, sleeves pushed to her elbows, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made the space feel alive. The faint scent of vanilla and cedar drifted through the room. Jazz played softly from a record player, that gentle crackle between songs filling the air like breath. The bookshelf stood, half assembled, near the wall. "You weren't joking," I said, laughing. She smiled. "I wasn't sure if you'd come. I wasn't sure you really needed help." I answered, and she laughed, a sound that made the air feel lighter. We worked side by side, the rhythm of small talk carrying us through the quiet. Each time our hands met over a tool or a piece of wood, something shifted, not dramatic but unmistakable. Her shoulder brushed mine once. She didn't move away. At one point, she stepped back to look at our work, arms folded. "You're surprisingly patient," she said. "Only because you're the one watching." I replied before I could stop myself. She looked at me for a long second, not startled, not offended, just searching. Then she smiled faintly and turned toward the record player. "You drink wine?" When she handed me a glass, her fingers grazed mine. We sat near the window. The city stretched below in scattered lights. She spoke about her favorite songs, the kind that remind her of people more than places. Her voice softened when she told me she hadn't let anyone into this space for a long time. "I didn't think I wanted company," she said, eyes tracing the rim of her glass. "But somehow you make quiet feel safe." I didn't answer. I just watched her, the way the lamplight painted gold on her cheekbones, the way she looked out the window like the night might answer for me. When she turned back, our faces were closer than either of us expected. My hand moved before I thought, just to steady the frame we'd been adjusting, but hers found mine halfway, fingers touching for a breath too long. Neither of us spoke. The record crackled, the wine in our glasses stilled, and the moment hung there, fragile and electric. She smiled barely. "You should probably go before I forget why I asked you here." I nodded, though neither of us moved. Outside, the hallway felt colder than before. Behind the closed door, the faint sound of music continued, slow, steady, and impossibly tender, like a heartbeat that wasn't ready to quiet down. Rain began to fall again that night, soft at first, like the world was exhaling. I hadn't planned to see her, but something in me couldn't stay away. Maybe it was the silence between us since the night at her apartment. Maybe it was the way I couldn't forget the sound of her laugh, or the warmth that lingered long after I left. When I knocked, she opened the door slowly, surprised but not displeased. "You'll catch a cold out there," she said, her voice low, gentle. "I didn't come because of the weather," I answered. For a moment, we just stood there, rain misting the air behind me, the faint glow of lamplight wrapping around her like a halo. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." The same record player hummed softly in the background, an old tune playing, something with violins and longing. I noticed the bookshelf, finally filled, standing perfectly straight against the wall. "Looks like it survived," I said. "Barely," she smiled. "You left before we tested it." There was laughter in her tone, but her eyes carried something heavier, the same conflict I'd seen the night I left. She poured me tea, not wine this time. "You don't always need to fix things," she said, handing me the cup. "I wasn't trying to fix anything," I replied. "I just missed being here." Her gaze softened, but she didn't look away. The rain outside deepened, drumming against the window in slow, steady rhythms. We talked for a while, about everything and nothing. About favorite films, about dreams that never quite became real. Her laughter came easier now, though there was always that trace of restraint, like a wall she'd built long ago and didn't fully trust herself to tear down. At some point, the conversation faded into quiet. I set my cup down and leaned back, watching her. The lamplight caught the curve of her face, the line of her neck, the way she absently twisted her ring as she thought. She felt my gaze, I could tell, but she didn't move. Instead, she drew in a slow breath, like she'd been holding something in for too long. Then, in a voice that trembled just slightly, she said, "You have no idea what you're doing to me." The world seemed to stop. The rain, the music, even my heartbeat. Her eyes flickered up to meet mine, searching for a reaction she didn't want to see. There was no game in her voice, no flirtation, just truth, raw and unguarded. I took a step closer, then another, until I could see the faint rise and fall of her breath. She didn't back away. Her hand brushed mine, light, uncertain, but full of meaning. The warmth of her skin sank into me, and I felt everything she wasn't saying. "I'm not trying to," I whispered back. She smiled faintly, eyes glistening in the lamplight. "That's what makes it worse." The record ended with a soft crackle. Neither of us moved to change it. We just stood there, two people caught somewhere between right and real, between what they should do and what their hearts had already decided. And when I finally left that night, I carried her whisper with me, quiet, trembling, unforgettable, echoing louder than the rain. Days slipped by without her. The cafe felt hollow, like a stage after the actors have left. The same song played over the speakers, but it sounded thinner somehow. Even the rain had stopped visiting, leaving the city bright and indifferent. I kept telling myself it was better this way, that what happened, what almost happened, needed space to fade. But the truth was simpler and far lonelier. I missed her. Not the conversation, not the coffee, her. Each morning, I found myself walking past that cafe window, pretending I wasn't looking for her silhouette. Sometimes I'd step inside, order something I didn't want, and sit at the same table we used to share. Her chair stayed empty, the light catching dust where her hands once rested. I replayed her whisper over and over. "You have no idea what you're doing to me." It came back in fragments. The sound of her breath, the tremor in her voice, the way the rain had blurred everything around us. I tried to distract myself with work, friends, noise, but she had a way of filling silence even when she wasn't there. I wondered if she was avoiding me, or if she simply didn't know how to return from that moment either. There are some lines that, once you cross them, you can't pretend they never existed. At night, I'd picture her apartment, the lamplight, the records stacked beside the player, the smell of vanilla that lingered in the air. I'd imagine her sitting by that window again, pretending to read, the pages untouched. Maybe she was trying to convince herself it had all been a mistake. Maybe she was angry at the way I made her feel younger, or worse, at the way she made me forget our difference in years. I wanted to call her, to knock on that door again, to say something, anything, that might make sense of what was left unsaid. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was afraid of turning something fragile into something broken. A week passed. Then two. The world kept moving, but part of me stayed suspended in that small, golden-lit room where time had paused between our breaths. One night, walking home through the quiet streets, I saw a woman who looked like her from behind. Same hair, same calm stride. My heart leapt before logic caught up. It wasn't her. It never was. The emptiness that followed wasn't sharp anymore. It was softer, heavier, like a bruise that refuses to fade. Maybe distance was her way of protecting us both. Or maybe it was punishment for crossing a line neither of us was ready to face. Either way, she was gone, and all I had were the echoes, her laughter, her words, her warmth still ghosting across my skin. And yet, some quiet part of me knew, stories like ours don't end in silence. They wait, patient, unfinished, for the next moment that refuses to stay buried. It was late evening when I returned to the cafe, the same one where everything had begun. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the amber glow of streetlights. I walked in, half hoping, half expecting to find her absence confirmed again. But there she was. She sat in the same spot by the window, the soft light catching her hair in golden strands. The book in front of her was open, but her eyes weren't on the pages. They were on me, calm, curious, and somehow knowing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I slid into the seat across from her, careful not to break the quiet that had settled between us like a shared secret. The background jazz hummed softly, the same song we had laughed along to before. Finally, I spoke. "I wasn't sure if you'd be here." She smiled, a small tilt of her lips, just enough to make her eyes glint. "I wondered the same," she replied. We talked quietly at first, about nothing in particular, the cafe, the weather, the little rhythms of our lives that had continued despite the gap between us. But every word felt heavier, filled with the weight of absence and longing. And then I looked at her, really looked at her, at the curve of her smile, the softness in her eyes, the subtle hesitation in her gestures that spoke louder than any words. And I said it, the thing I hadn't been able to say for weeks. Maybe I don't know what I'm doing to you, but I know what you've done to me. Her lips parted, and for a heartbeat, she looked startled. Then she smiled, fully, without restraint. It wasn't just a polite acknowledgement or a fleeting expression. It was the kind of smile that carries relief, recognition, and the quiet surrender of someone who's been waiting for this moment as much as you have. She reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. This time, there was no hesitation, no trembling. Her fingers laced with mine gently, intentionally. The warmth spread slowly, like sunlight touching cold skin. Then, maybe it's time we stop pretending, she whispered. I leaned closer, my shoulder brushing hers. The café seemed to shrink around us, the ambient noise fading into a soft hum. We didn't need words. The small touches, the shared glances, the gentle pressure of her hand against mine. All of it spoke louder than anything we could have said. When we finally stood to leave, the city outside felt different, softer, warmer, as though it had been waiting for us too. We walked side by side, shoulders occasionally brushing, the quiet comfort of presence replacing the tension that had haunted us for so long. At her door, she paused and looked up at me. I smiled, and she mirrored it, leaning slightly into me. Her hand stayed in mine, solid and steady, a promise without words. And when I left that night, it wasn't with longing, regret, or uncertainty. It was with the quiet, simple joy of knowing we had returned to each other. Not because we had to, not because it was easy, but because we had chosen it. Some stories are gentle, some are slow, and some, like ours, are worth every silent, trembling moment that led to this.